A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Guerrero.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerechtbare Brüder in Amerika, so tausend Schabbos at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little, it is never too late, and it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode has been generously sponsored by Ari Stock in memory of his brother Gershom Yeshaya ben Avram Olav Shalom. And this episode is about London Jewry. It's actually part 2. I had part 1 not so long ago, a couple of months ago, I believe. And it was very popular. We got some great feedback, and I decided that it's appropriate to continue with it. I think this story of London Jewry is quite fascinating, and we ended off last time with the expulsion in 1290, the Edict of Expulsion by King Edward, and the Jews are no longer in England at that point. And it happens to be in the news now. I just saw in the news either the British government or the church or both, I'm not sure which, they have an intention to apologize for the year 1290 expulsion. So, I guess an apology is due at some point. So it's appropriate now in the news. So, therefore, we could continue speaking about London. We'll pick up from there, from the expulsion. So for several hundred years, there's not really any Jewish community in organized, official Jewish community. There are some Jews that are living there secretly. There are some Jewish visitors or businessmen. There are occasional stories of Jews being there, but undercover, definitely not in any official capacity. There are exceptional cases of Jews visiting England. There's an interesting story of Jacob Barnett, who is a lecturer at Oxford in the 1600s, an Italian Jew. He's brought there at some point, and he is living there, and he's convinced to convert, or decides to convert, and then he goes against that decision and decides to leave town, and they arrest him, and he's released, and a whole interesting story of how a Jew is not able to live as a Jew, and that's in the early 1600s. So you're talking about almost about 400 years. Over 300 years after the original expulsion. So what happens is that the real first Jews to resettle in England is even before the resettlement officially begins with Oliver Cromwell, which I'll get to in a second. But it happens because of one of the most impactful events in Jewish history, which is the Spanish Expulsion, the Alhambra Decree, which expels all non-Catholics from Spain in 1492, and that creates the Spanish diaspora. And we can talk forever about the Spanish diaspora, but one of the more interesting quirks of Jewish history is that some of them eventually end up in England, and Conversos, as they're known, or New Christians, or all kinds of other names that they're referred to as, but there are Spanish Jews living under Christian identities who end up in England, and they're the first Jews to settle in England, and that happens following the Spanish Expulsion. So you have, again, from 1290 until after the Spanish expulsion is over 2 centuries later, so there's really basically no record of any Jew living in England, almost none. There's Jews who convert to Christianity are allowed to live in some sort of home for them in London. That's an interesting story also, but they're they're converts to the church, and then you have these Conversos who live in England. They live there secretly. And part of the story of the Spanish Jewish diaspora is the fact that they're the first Jewish integrationists. They're the first Jews who integrate into Christian society, many of them becoming completely Christian, many of them living with a double identity, many of them who were merchants and businessmen and travelers. This is also the age of exploration in the New World. So many of them live as a Jew openly in some countries, and then when they live in other countries, they live under a Christian identity. So that's a fascinating story of the Spanish diaspora, especially since we assume that the first Jewish assimilation takes place in Germany in the 17th and 18th centuries, when really the Spanish Jewish diaspora precedes them in a much more interesting story in the 15th century, 15th and 16th centuries, I should rather. So that's the first Jews who settle in England, but again, they're not in any official capacity, and also they're not in an official Jewish community with an official synagogue. None of that exists yet. So what we have is the slow reacceptance of Jews into England, which takes place over several years in the 1650s, and that's a fascinating story. I find it one of the most interesting stories of British Jewish history in general, and even of Jewish history. Oliver Cromwell and the petitions of Menashe ben Israel, ben Yisrael, who's also, all these amazing characters who come into play. It becomes quite a tale. So you have this unofficial reacceptance of Jews into England, which doesn't become official. They don't rescind the original Edict of Expulsion. Cromwell does not legislate that Jews are allowed to live in England. It's basically they kind of look the other way, and it's in an unofficial capacity, which actually does good for the Jewish community, because Cromwell is the Lord Protector or dictator or whatever you want to call him. He is there until eventually the monarchy is reinstated. It's at the time of the British Civil War, and when Charles II becomes the king again later on, he's not able to repeal this piece of non-legislation because it's an unofficial decree. So it's kind of providential for the Jewish community, because if it had been an official decree, an official legislation of Cromwell, then we can probably speculate that Charles would have repealed that legislation as part of the legacy of the rebellion against the monarchy, of the Civil War, and because it was unofficial, because it was just looking the other way, and also because of other factors, Charles in his exile owed a lot to some Jewish financiers and stuff, which is also a common theme in Jewish history. So he did not repeal any of this non-legislation because it was an unofficial capacity. But on the other hand, it does become a bit strange, because the development of the British Jewish community over the next couple of centuries is all unofficial. Literally, for the next 2 centuries. The Edict of Expulsion is only officially rescinded many years later, and officially the British Jews become emancipated many years later. So they have this very unofficial status for quite a bit of time. So the question is, what are Cromwell's motives? Why does he decide to allow Jews to resettle in England? And that becomes the big story. That becomes one of the biggest questions of British Jewish history. One of the most fascinating questions. In other words, this expulsion was in effect, and it would have remained that way for who knows how long, for many more centuries, and would have changed a lot of Jewish history had England not have had a Jewish community throughout the centuries. And there's this, all of a sudden, and it seems to be quite sudden, a little bit, some of it was gradual, But all of a sudden, Cromwell decides to allow them in. So what were his motives? Why did he do that? So some of it was religious. They thought that they would be able to convert the Jews. Also there was this kind of like, I guess, messianic belief that the British, either the British themselves were from the 10 lost tribes, or again, this is the 17th century when the New World, there's all kinds of legends about the New World, and the 10 lost tribes are there, and it has to do with the second coming, and all kinds of religious reasons that would necessitate the Jews to be allowed back into England. It was primarily economic. This is right after the British Civil War, and this has to be seen in the context of British history. The British Civil War, the execution of Charles I, which is like the end of the monarchy, and you have to understand how Oliver Cromwell in general is seen in the big scheme of things of British history and European history. Is he a hero? Is he a villain? Is he seen by many as in different ways? Someone who killed the king, who got rid of the monarchy. So is that his legacy, or did he create the First Republic? Everyone actually sees it through their own lens. It's interesting. Leon Trotsky saw him as a class revolutionary because he got rid of the aristocracy and the king. I don't know if he got rid of the aristocracy. He was a member of the aristocracy, but he got rid of the king. Winston Churchill saw him as a military dictator. So everyone sees that in their way. He's seen till today as one of the most popular people in British history, and as a hero and statues and everything. So on the other hand, he did not like Catholics too much, and he oversaw what seems to be a mass murder, possibly even of genocidal proportions of Catholics in Ireland, and in general, there was blood in England of those days. There was the British sentiment was anti-Catholic. That's because of the post-Reformation and the Church of England and all that. In fact, the Jews received emancipation in the 19th century. It was following the emancipation of the Catholics. The Catholics were able to receive equal rights and citizenship. So it followed, therefore, that if even the Catholics got it, then the Jews would get it too. So there was a lot of anti-Catholic discrimination in England at the time. So there's this legacy of Cromwell. Of course, Jews love Cromwell because he was the one who allowed the resettlement of Jews in England. So there's, like I said, there was the Civil War, and that damaged the economy. So he wanted to reboost the economy, and throughout Jewish history, Jews are always seen as businessmen, merchants, cosmopolitan, international connections. There was also this growing rivalry with the Netherlands. The centrality of Amsterdam in the age of it's post already after the age of exploration, but this is in the settlement of the New World and the getting the riches of the New World, and the Dutch have the greatest merchant marine fleet in the world, and Amsterdam's the Dutch East India Company, the West India Company, and the first stock market, and there's this growing the biggest port in mainland Europe. And the Jews are playing a major role in the building of the Amsterdam economy. And of course, the Jews there are all Spanish Jews. They're descendants of the ones who were expelled, of Conversos, New Christians. And there's this rivalry with the Netherlands. And Cromwell wants to build London as the center of commerce and of the sea, the navy, of the seas. And therefore, he wants to attract the Dutch Spanish Jews to London to play that role in building up the London Stock Exchange and that investment, and to use the Spanish Dutch Jews, their connection with the Spanish Main of what's today the countries of South America. Then it was called the Spanish Main because the colonies of the Netherlands and of England were very, very small and insignificant, paled in insignificance compared to Spain. They were mainly islands. Under Cromwell, the British take control of Jamaica, which also is a major role both in British history but also in Jewish British history, because in Jamaica, Jews are allowed to settle. They're allowed to receive land titles and full equal rights, citizenship, and the Jews of Jamaica become the most prominent and wealthiest Jews in the world at the time. The Jewish community in Jamaica becomes extremely prominent. There's also the role of the Jewish pirates in Jamaica, which I've mentioned before, and their attempts at taking the Spanish gold ships on the high seas. And there's the role of the Jews in Jamaica and its effect on the Jewish resettlement in England, because it all happens at the same time in the early 1650s. So there's also the winds of change in England in general. Religious tolerance and anti-Catholicism is replacing anti-Semitism following the Reformation. So there's less anti-Semitism, and there's all kinds of streams of thought to allow the Jewish resettlement. That's on the Cromwell side of the story. On the other side, of the Jewish side of the story, there's this fascinating personality named Menashe ben Menashe ben Israel, who is, again, you can't cover him and his whole life story in this episode because he definitely deserves his own, even though the famous Rembrandt painting is most probably of his son, not of him, but there are other paintings of his. And he was originally a Spanish Jew, Portuguese Jew from a new Christian Converso family, and he settles in the Netherlands, and he becomes one of the most influential Jews in the world in the 17th century. He's a rabbi. He owns a printing press. He's a writer, a thinker, an activist, a politician, everything that you want, everything that you can imagine. And a very colorful personality, very charismatic as well, with great connections all over the world with this, Spanish Jewish diaspora. And he has his own motives to getting the Jews resettled in England, also somewhat messianic motives, surprisingly enough. He feels that with Jews settling the New World, so if we have the Jewish diaspora, and there's a lot of messianic notions in the centuries following the Spanish Expulsion, and some saw it and saw the justification for it in messianic terms, that there would be if the Jewish diaspora spreads to literally the four corners of the globe, as in the prophecy of the prophets spoke about it, that this way it would enable the Messiah to come, the redemption to come, because the redemption can only arrive once the diaspora had been spread to the four corners of the globe. And now in the age of exploration, that new parts of the world were being explored and settled, and there were members of the Spanish Jewish diaspora who were settling in these new colonies, so now they're literally spreading to all corners of the world. So we have to find those isolated few countries that had expelled Jews in Europe, such as England, that still did not allow Jews, and they were the only places in the world now left that did not have Jews. And if we convince them to resettle Jews there, then the Jews will have achieved that they're in the four corners of the world, and the redemption can now come. So he had his own messianic motives for getting the Jews back into England. He wrote a pamphlet in that regard to convince them, and the contributions of the Jewish people. It's an interesting statement in that pamphlet is his assessment of Polish Jewry at the time. And this is right at the end of the golden age of Polish Jewry, because this is right after the Tach V'Tat Chmielnicki massacres. So it's just a couple of years later in the 1650s. So but it's it's right after the Polish Jews had been in all their glory, and he writes how the Polish kingdom had invited the Jews to come settle there, and how they had built the economy of the Polish kingdom to make it the most successful kingdom in all of Europe at the time, and the contribution that Polish Jews made to that. So it's great to have Jews in your country. So he's invited by Cromwell as this prominent Dutch-Spanish Jew with connections in the Netherlands, the Amsterdam Jewish community. He's invited by Cromwell on an official visit of a Jew to England, to a state visit to negotiate the resettlement of Jews. And there's the Whitehall Conference, which Menashe ben Israel and his whole delegation attends, with the pros and the cons, the voices against and pro resettling the Jews in England. And Menashe ben Israel stays in England for 2 years, from 1655 to 1657, to negotiate this whole process of resettling the Jews there. and that becomes the first major step in that regard. Side tidbit of his absence from Amsterdam is that Menashe ben Israel, who was very educated in the sciences and philosophy, and today we would consider him controversial even. So he had a student in his yeshiva in Amsterdam, and that student's name was Benedict or Baruch Spinoza, and he was a very brilliant and philosophically inclined student of his in Amsterdam. And it was during his absence from Amsterdam that the Amsterdam Jewish community puts the excommunication on Spinoza, the now famous excommunication on Spinoza, because of his heretical thoughts and teachings. And that was while Menashe ben Israel was in London. And one can always wonder and speculate if the influential and charismatic Menashe ben Israel had been in Amsterdam during that time, would the community have excommunicated Spinoza, and with the approval of his teacher Menashe ben Israel or not? And of course, that's just a fun speculation to do around Thursday night Shalom. Either way, getting back to Menashe ben Israel and Cromwell, so another thing takes place during that same exact time, which makes the question of resettlement of Jews in England even more fascinating. Because England is fighting wars against the Dutch, they're fighting wars against Spain, and in 1656, there's a declaration of war against Spain, and there's this arrest of a Spanish Jew named Antonio Rodriguez Robles, and he was a new Christian, and he was a trader and a merchant between England and the New World. And he's arrested, so his property is seized, being that he's a citizen of a country that England is at war with. They're at war with Spain, and he's Spanish. But he's a new Christian, he's a converso. So Robles petitions the court for the return of his seized property on the account of his being Jewish rather than Spanish, which is absolutely a fascinating petition, because we assume that Jewish nationalism is born in the 19th century because nationalism does not exist in the 17th century anywhere, not Jewish, not non-Jewish. And it's a totally 19th century invention. It doesn't exist beforehand. And here Robles is asking the court for something amazing. He's telling them, I'm not Spanish, I'm Jewish, right? And citizenship is not really, again, nationalism doesn't exist in the modern term. What he's saying is that his secret religious identity and his is not to be confused with his public identity as a Christian, and hence, which is his Spanish identity. He's saying that his secret Jewish identity is different than his public Christian identity, and his public Christian identity is what's really Spanish, but that's not his real identity. His real identity is Jewish, and hence it's not Spanish, because Spanish means Catholic. You cannot be anything other than Catholic if you're Spanish. And since he's Jewish, he can't really be considered Spanish. So the question is, who is a Jew, and what is this fellow Robles? What is he really? And maybe we can consider him English, because and that contributes to the dialogue of whether Jews should be resettled in England or not. So this becomes a very a part of the whole discussion, and eventually there's never a public decision or public legislation that's made about it. It's rather they decide to look the other way. A Jewish community is allowed to exist publicly, and some of these conversos come out of the closet, as it were. Some of them actually moved to England from Amsterdam, from Spain, from other places in Europe, and from the New World, and a Jewish community slowly starts to emerge in London in the late 1600s. As a result, even after Charles II returns to the throne, and of course Cromwell is posthumously executed. He dies in 1658 and buried in Westminster Abbey, and then when the crown is restored, a couple of years later, so King Charles II makes a triumphant return. The royalists are back in power in England, and they exhume Cromwell's body, and he's executed again, even though he's dead, which is an interesting thing. And he's buried, I think, in several places, kind of like some of the graves here in Israel. And then and then his legacy becomes a matter of dispute afterwards. But the Jewish question is kind of settled already because the Jewish community is starting to emerge in London. There's even a Jew named Solomon de Medina, who is the first Jew to be knighted in British history in the year 1700, not long after. And there's both a Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jewish congregations emerge in London in the late 1600s. So there's this emergence of Jewish life very quickly. And there's only several tens of families, only 30, 40 families, Jewish families who are in London at this time. Almost all of them Sephardic, almost all of them Spanish Jews who had either come from Spain or had been living in London secretly or came primarily from Amsterdam. And they're very wealthy, very prominent in finance and commerce, and very, very prominent in London society. And that continues. Now, before I get back to London Jewish life, I just want to mention quickly about the stages of emancipation, and we have to literally jump centuries to achieve that. It's only in 1858, 200 years later, that full emancipation is achieved. Literally 200 years have to pass. And it's also the same year that a change in the law in regards to the oath of office to Parliament. Lionel de Rothschild becomes the first practicing Jew to become a member of the British Parliament, and they have to change the law because on my good faith or on my good word, I forget the exact language of the oath of office. On my good faith as a Christian was the official wording of the oath of office, and that was changed just so Lionel de Rothschild can take the oath of office without having to say on my good faith as a Christian. There had been another Jew who was already a member of Parliament, Benjamin Disreali, but who was born a Jew, but at the age of 12 he was baptized, so he did not have any issue with the oath. So it was changed only for Rothschild in 1858. There had been similar oaths that had been rescinded years earlier for membership as a broker on the stock exchange, and in the business world that had come early before the political world, those changes in that same oath of on my faith as a Christian. 1868, only 10 years later, Benjamin Disreali becomes the Prime Minister of England. So he's the first, technically Jewish by birth, but he was not Jewish, he was Christian. He was only Jewish by birth. A few years later, in 1884, Baron Nathan Rothschild, who was the son of Lionel Rothschild, becomes the first practicing Jew as the member of the House of Lords. Again, the first practicing Jew. Disreali was already a member of the House of Lords, and his son Walter was actually the recipient of the Balfour Declaration 2 years following his father's passing. So by 1882, which is when the great immigration begins from the Jews of Eastern Europe to England, like everywhere else in the world. So if we freeze that moment, there's 46,000 Jews living in England in 1882. And by 1890, Jewish emancipation and integration into British life was complete in every sense of the word. So that's the process of integration. We take a step back. So we have the Sephardic Jewish community. We have also German Jewish immigration in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Also achieved great wealth, emancipation, and then integration into British society. And then we go to the institutions that they build. There's the Bevis Marks Synagogue, which was world famous and becomes the first major synagogue. There is an Ashkenazic congregation also, which later becomes the Great Synagogue of London, whose chief rabbis become the chief rabbis of England, of the British Empire, of the Commonwealth, of the United Kingdom, whatever you want to call it. And that's Ashkenazic, that's German Jewish, and there's some quite prominent and famous rabbis who we'll perhaps get to soon. But I want to focus on the Bevis Marks Synagogue, the first synagogue. That's a Sephardic, Spanish-Portuguese. They already start in the 1600s. They enter the current building in 1701, and it's the oldest still functioning synagogue continuously since its founding in Europe. Very prominent, very influential throughout Jewish history in the last several centuries, and also a gorgeous building, a magnificent structure, was never destroyed. It was not destroyed during World War II. Unlike the Great Synagogue of like the Ashkenazi one, which I mentioned, which was destroyed during the London Blitz, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe bombing of London in 1941. But the Bevis Marks Synagogue was the center of the Sephardic Jewish life in England, and to a certain extent of the Western world in general, along with the Spanish Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam and other prominent Jewish communities, the Sephardic Jewish communities in the New World. It influenced, Bevis Marks had an influence across the British Empire, had strong connections with the Jewish community in Jamaica, Barbados, the Jewish community in India, the wealthy Sephardic Jews of Baghdad who migrated to India and later to Shanghai were strongly connected to the Bevis Marks Synagogue as well. In fact, the Sassoon Synagogue in Shanghai, I think it was called again it's not in my notes, I'm trying to remember, I think it's the Ohel Moshe, Ohel something or another, was modeled on the Bevis Marks Synagogue. So it had influence all over the world. And its most prominent members were, of course, Moses Montefiore, whose seat there is cordoned off, roped off till today, and it's only used on very prominent, very official occasions where important visitors who come to the Bevis Marks Synagogue are allowed to use his seat. Isaac Disreali, Benjamin Disreali's father, was a member of was also a very aristocratic member of London society in general. He leaves the Bevis Marks Synagogue after a dispute with the leadership, and that's what leads him to complete assimilation into British society and to the baptism of his children. There was great rabbis of the Bevis Marks Synagogue and of the Sephardic London Jewish community. First, Rabbi David Nieto, and later his son Isaac Nieto, which was a Italian Sephardic rabbinical family, very prominent and influential in London Jewish life. Later on, other rabbis as well. The rabbis were always referred to as the Chachamim, as was the Sephardic custom. Rabbi David Nieto was a controversial figure. He wrote a very defensive of Jewish tradition, a book called Kuzari Sheni, and Matedan, it was called Kuzari Sheni, and it was written in Hebrew and Spanish, and it was similar to the Kuzari of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the medieval defense of the Jewish belief system. So he wrote it as a defense of the oral law, of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and against the Karaites and against other, anyone who else disputed the veracity, the truth, the authenticity of the oral law, and defense of the Talmud. And he became a very, very important work of Jewish faith. He fought against Sabbatian heresy. He wrote all kinds of books in that regard also. So he was very prominent in his literary output as well. It's interesting that the current rabbi in the Bevis Marks Synagogue is both Ashkenazi and American. So he's not British or Sephardic. He's a descendant of Rav Lazer Silver in the United States. His name is Rabbi Shalom Morris, and he's doing great work there as well. So Moses Montefiore becomes one of the most famous Jews in Jewish history, the most prominent and influential Jew of the 19th century. I think we need to have a episode devoted just to Moses Montefiore and his influence. He's, of course, knighted by Queen Victoria in 1837, shortly after her ascension to the throne. And then you have the Rothschild era. Nathan Rothschild, who's the brother-in-law of Montefiore, and he establishes his business in 1798 in Manchester, but of course soon comes and becomes a London bank. He was sent there by his father, the founder of the Rothschild dynasty, Mayor Amschel Rothschild, and Nathan Rothschild goes on to fund Wellington in the Napoleonic Wars. He becomes the ones who he funds the British government's investment in the Suez Canal. He funds Cecil Rhodes in the colonization of Africa, and Nathan Rothschild and Montefiore define British Jewry in the 19th century. One a German Jew, one a Sephardic Jew, one in Bevis Marks and one in the Great Synagogue, and they're financiers. The London Stock Exchange, banking, finance, they and the titles and the Victorian England. Queen Victoria, of course, is the queen for 63 years during the 19th century. And the next stage, the part 3, which we'll hopefully get to sooner than the space between part 1 and 2, hopefully be quicker, we'll have to discuss British Jewry, London Jewry in the 19th century, the Victorian era, and especially these two families, or really two individuals, the Rothschilds, which is a family, and Montefiore as an individual, and how that fits in with the Victorian era and the emancipation of British Jewry at that time. And I would like to get to also talk about, in part 3, the chief rabbis of the British Empire in the 19th century, who were some 18th and 19th century, who were some prominent individuals, mainly from Germany, who served in the Great Synagogue. And that will lead us all the way to the immigration of Eastern European Jews in the late 19th century and the decisive turn of Jewish history in England as a result of their immigration. So this was Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudigeber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, and sponsorships. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at @Soundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.